I often get requests and people asking to know more about me personally. I've always kind of held off on sharing anything about my identification for two reasons primarily. Number one, I get a lot of threats. I know it may sound strange, but running a channel called God, Family, and Guns means a lot of people hate you because they hate what you represent. We've even been threatened by ISIS. I've in the past had to contact the FBI and start forwarding them information from threats I've received. I kind of get over that as time goes by. I felt a little more comfortable with that. They still come though. The second reason is more of a personal reason, and that's just that I'm quite honestly not very proud of a lot of things I've done in my past. Growing up, I was more self-destructive than anything else, and I often think that people that knew me growing up would watch some of these videos and think that guy should not be doing that. But you know, people change over time. I always kind of considered myself a rough around the edges pastor. So who is God, Family, and Guns? Well, I'm going to share as much as I can with you right after this. Well, I'll start off by telling you my name is Mark. I was born and raised in Lee Summit, Missouri. Love Lee Summit, Missouri. Still live there now. Live there with my wife, and she was also born and raised in Lee Summit, Missouri. I kind of jokingly say growing up I was raised by wolves. What I mean by that was my mother was very much a hippie, and which is great. I mean, she was very loving and kind, but I was the youngest of 5, so I was able to really just do whatever it is I wanted to do. I specifically remember running the streets of Lee Summit as early as 3, 4, 5 in the morning, as young as 10, 9 years old. Just what I did. And you know, I would mostly say growing up in high school I was more self-destructive than anything else. As we go back to high school reunions, people always tell my wife, Mark was a very nice guy. It's very true. I never really did anything to harm anybody else. Again, it was more self-harm than anything else out there. I think really the problem was I just didn't know any better. I had no direction. I just was running wild. After high school, of course at a very young age, I got married and had a daughter, my very first daughter. I was so young I couldn't even go to the liquor store. It was a very young age. But it was about that time that I found God. Early on, probably about early 20s, I worked in an electronics store in Kansas City called BrandSmart. They're out of business now, but it was a very awesome place to work. Sold stereos and VCRs and TVs and stuff. And one day I was talking to my manager about God, and he said, do you know if you're going to heaven? And I said, well gosh, I really don't know. And he shared with me about Jesus Christ. And it was that afternoon that I went home, and at the time I lived in a building that had an elevator, and I was in that elevator and I just kind of pictured what it would be like if the elevator crashed and I died. And it was right then in that elevator I prayed to Jesus Christ for my salvation. I do believe I was saved in that moment. However, I didn't really know God, and I definitely wasn't treating him as Lord. It was a few years later, I was out jogging one day, kind of praying, and I really thought about what it would be like to sacrifice my only child like God did for me. And it was that moment I thought I could never do that. There's nobody on this planet I love enough that I would sacrifice my own child. But yet God loved me that much that he sacrificed his only begotten son. And it was in that moment, it just brought me to tears. I never felt so loved in my life, and I kind of just fell to my knees. I was running around the plaza, the country club plaza area in Kansas City, and I just right there on the sidewalk just fell on my knees and just said, everything's different at this point. And then moving forward, everything was. That same day I went home and I shared that experience with my wife, and she thought I was crazy. And I wanted to go to church, and she didn't want to go with me. And then I kind of wanted more to life, and it was about then that I went to college. And at the time I kind of thought I wanted to go to medical school, so I majored in biology and chemistry, and early on realized I did not want to do that, so I became a teacher. And it was right around that time that I went through my divorce. It's a really kind of an ugly time in my life. It was very challenging, but it is what it is, and I went through it, as a lot of you have as well. At the time, my first teaching job, I worked at Northeast High School for 9 years. Of course, I was a single father during this time. I had really long hair. I could even put it in a ponytail. I was kind of a young hippie myself to some degree. I think if you ask me what my characteristics are, I'm kind of a cross between a hillbilly, hippie, and a Christian is the best way I can describe it. But I think that's good because I was always able to relate to everybody. Even in high school, I didn't have a crowd. In college, I didn't have a crowd. I never had a crowd. I would hang out with everybody. I think again, going back to reunions, people would know me regardless of what clique they were in. I just knew everybody. I never felt into a clique. I, in a strange way, didn't belong, but as a result, I kind of could relate to everybody. In 2009, I was laid off. It was during the Great Recession, and there were 40,000 teachers laid off that year, and I was one of them, and it was a very challenging year. My kids were still pretty young, and of course, you know, they weren't out working, so as a single father, that was it. It was just me. And I did what I could. I actually started making wine. I opened a winery called Bent Tree Wine in Kansas City. That took a better part of about 6 months just to get licensed to do that. But I kind of thought, well, if we're going to hit a Great Depression, people will buy alcohol, so I made alcohol. But it was shortly after that I got an opportunity from a friend to help open a charter school in New York City and Harlem. I was skeptical to take that opportunity, but there was just an incredible group of individuals who were some of the best educators I'd ever known in my life. Were going into one of the roughest districts in one of the roughest parts of town in the world to open a charter school, and I kind of wanted it in. I wanted in on that. So I didn't move to New York City. I commuted from Kansas City. I know it sounds strange, but my sister worked for an airline and she made me her buddy, so I flew every Friday and Saturday. I would go to New York City for most of the week, and then by Friday at about 7 o'clock I was back at home in Kansas City. It was really an adventure of a year, and I told them I'd do it for a year. Now the following year, when school started, they promoted me. I was doing most of their discipline and working as their dean as well. And I kind of enjoyed it, to be quite honest, and I was going to stay, but I got to about October and I thought, no, this isn't right. I wasn't going to become this guy that lives in New York City raising a family in Kansas City. It was very temporary, so I went back. Kansas City was bringing their teachers back, and they offered me a job back, so I took it, and that was at Lincoln College Prep. Loved working there. It's a fantastic school. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest schools there are, definitely in the state of Missouri. But it was about that same time that then after I worked at Lincoln for a few years, that I kind of made this shift to Christian education, because I was just seeing public education go a direction that I really didn't particularly agree with. Throughout the entire time, I was deeply involved in the church. Regardless of where I was, when I was in New York City, I was going to the Brooklyn Tabernacle. When I was in Kansas City, I went to several different churches. Very, very deeply involved, and we were starting to see things happen in schools and in churches that were a little more dangerous, and I became part of a security team at our church. It was a big mega church in Lee Summit, and I became part of the security team and received a lot of training. But it was during that time I was trying to learn a lot about guns. I just didn't know much about guns. I knew how to use a gun. I just didn't know much about specifics on brands and that kind of thing. So I started watching YouTube like you all do. During that time, what I discovered was, and of course this was early on, was that most people, if you clicked on a video on a certain gun, you'd have like 10 seconds of somebody just shooting the gun. Or maybe there's a half-naked woman shooting a machine gun, or there's a lot of cursing with terrible editing. And at this point, I had remarried, and married a girl I dated in high school, and I'm still married to her now. But I brought it up about, I was complaining about these things, and she said, well, you could do better, why don't you do it? So I did. And I decided to really turn the focus more about God, family, and also guns, because those are the three most important things to me at that point in my life. I love God with all my heart, and I love my family with all my heart. And, you know, really the only reason I'm fascinated with guns is, well, two reasons. One, for self-defense, but two, I'm just incredibly infatuated with precision and mechanics. Anytime somebody could build things that are precise and work well, I just really like that kind of thing. When I was in college, I collected old clocks for the exact same reason. Just love the mechanics of a good old clock. So I really also on my channel wanted to share more about just kind of what I was experiencing at church and as a teacher and eventually a principal around security. But the very first video that I had that got a strike, a community strike against it, had to do with that. So I wouldn't post any more videos on that thing, because, as you know, if you know, 3 community strikes and they shut your channel down. I will say at this point that, you know, we are building our Patreon quite a bit. Not trying to put a Patreon plug in there, but there's a lot of things I can say on Patreon that I don't say on YouTube. It's as cheap as $1 if you're interested. That link is below. But ultimately, you know, I started this channel to do this thing, but early on I was praying about it, and it felt like I was doing a lot of things on guns, because I posted my first 13 videos at the same time, and all of them just had stuff to do with guns and nothing had anything to do with God. And I just wanted to change that. And as I prayed, God said, well, that's it, you know. And he asked me if I'd take prayer requests at the end of every video and put scripture at the end of every video. So in that moment, I partnered with him and I followed his direction. More so, not only have I partnered with him, but I put him in charge of this channel. And that's why we take prayer requests, and that's why this focus is even on God. And what I've discovered is it is a light in an incredibly dark world. The internet's a very, very dark world. I think 20 years from now, people are going to be ashamed at the way our culture was when it was revolving around the internet. I think many people will probably be disgusted with the way we behaved with the internet 20, 30, 40 years from now. So I'm trying to just break through as being light in that dark world. Yes, we do guns, but really in the end, it's not just about guns. It's about creating this thing where, whether we talked about lawnmowers or barbecuing or whatever, we throw God in there. Because in the end, if people find God because of a common hobby of guns, that is awesome. I get millions of comments, well, maybe not millions, but I get thousands of comments of people saying that they've grown closer to God because they watched a Ruger 1022 video, or they're going to church now because they were watching this top 5 concealed carry guns list video, and then they just, for whatever reason, and I can't really say it's the God in the videos, because God is in these videos. So that's kind of me. I will share that, but when I was in New York City, that's when I was ordained as a pastor. I sought after that primarily because I had a friend who was living with his girlfriend, and their pastor wouldn't marry them because they were living in sin. And I thought, well, what a better way to get out of that, living in sin, than to get married. So he said, well, will you marry us? And I said, well, let me see if I can get ordained. So I connected with the church that I've been involved with greatly, and we just made it happen. That's how I became a pastor. So, you know, that just sharing really about me is kind of hard to do, and there's a lot more to me than that. I just kind of wanted to give the skeleton version of who I am and what I'm about. You know, the best way I could describe it is my teaching style is I'm a mad scientist at heart. I'm always trying to get to something quick. That's the kind of scientist I am. That's the kind of person I generally am. I'm not very organized. But I get places quick. I get to the results faster than most people that take the time to plan it. But also, I care about God more than anything in the world, and I truly am about my Father's business. I'm constantly seeking Him, asking Him for directions, and if He tells me to take a left, I'm going to take a left. I'm just that kind of guy. If I'm driving down the highway and God says, I want you to pull over and do the hokey pokey on the side of the road, you might drive by and see me doing that. And I might not understand why God is doing what He does, but there's always a reason. I met a pastor friend one time who told me that he one time had a young lady come to him and say, God told me to go out front and do cartwheels. And he said, well, that sounds crazy to me, but, you know, whatever. So she did. She went out in the front of the church and just did cartwheels. Later that week, a guy called that pastor and said that he did not believe in God, and he was dragged to church by a relative, and he heard his sermon, and it was okay. But he said, you know what, God, if you're real, then have somebody do cartwheels. And he walked out of the church and his girl's doing cartwheels. And it changed him. And to that girl, that never made any sense to her, but it is what it is. And this channel does so much more than I will ever know. And I believe that wholeheartedly. I think we just really know a fraction of the breakthroughs that God is getting through a common hobby of guns. I mean, come on, that's awesome. So, you know, again, that's why we do what we do, and that's a little bit of who I am. Right now, I'm a father of 5 kids between my wife and I. We, of course, are a blended family, and she's just adorable and wonderful, and these kids are great, and their youngest are in high school now, so we're almost empty nesters, and we just do what we do. And, you know, so that's, again, there's a lot more to me than that, but that's the gist of it. So I hope this helps. I really kind of wanted you to get to know me more for that reason as well. So if you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support our channel through Patreon, that link is also below. But the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests. Never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.